You know that feeling, right? Like you're constantly pulled in a million directions. Your own thoughts, your family, work, and then this whole other world the minute you step outside the city, your neighborhood, all that public life buzzing around you.
Yeah, that a constant negotiation.
Okay, let's unpack this because it turns out the spaces we live in, from our, most private corners to the busiest streets, are shaped by really old fundamental ideas.
What's fascinating is that this isn't just about the buildings or the layout. Our understanding of what's public and what's private has deep roots in how philosophers and societies have evolved over centuries. These aren't just neutral settings. They actively influence how we live, who we interact with, and even how we see ourselves.
Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we're going to explore this relationship between public and private spaces in the city. We've got a bunch of really interesting stuff here, from psychology to philosophy, how cities are planned, and even some history.
Right. Thinkers have been wrestling with these ideas for ages, from all different viewpoints.
And if we zoom out for a second, you'll see this isn't just some abstract topic. It really matters for how we experience our daily lives in urban environments.
Mm hmm. Understanding these dynamics can give you a totally new way of looking at the spaces you move through every day.
Our goal today is to give you that new perspective, those aha moments that help you understand why your surroundings feel the way they do without getting bogged down in complicated stuff.
Yeah, hit that sweet spot. Informed, maybe a little surprised.
So, with a topic this big, where do we even begin?
That raises a crucial question. What do we even mean by private and public? You might be surprised at how connected these ideas actually are. The word private itself has a bit of a negative history.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it comes from the Latin privis, which means single or individual, but it also carried a sense of being withdrawn or even missing something privaire meant to deprive.
Huh.
So right from the start, private had this sense of something being taken away.
Almost like being cut off from something important.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And Hannah Arendt even suggested that a life lived entirely in private
Mm.
could be seen as lacking significance, without impact on the wider world.
Right. But then you look at other ways we define privacy: being left alone, having your own space, controlling your personal information, like our source by Wax points out.
Exactly. Those are much more about having control and autonomy.
Hmm.
So the core insight here is that privacy isn't just one thing, it's a multifaceted concept.
So it's not just about physically being alone, it's about having the power to decide when and how we're connected.
Exactly. Gavison gave us a helpful way to think about privacy as having a few different layers. Keeping secrets, what information is known about you, avoiding unwanted attention, anonymity, and controlling who has physical access to you, solitude.
Okay.
This starts to have implications for how we use space, but as Gavison noted, you can't really expect complete privacy in a public park.
Right.
You can't legally claim a loss of privacy just because someone glances at you while you're reading on a park bench.
Yeah, there's a big difference between hoping to blend in and having a legal expectation of being completely unseen in a public square.
And then we have the right to privacy in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which protects us from unreasonable interference in our personal lives, our families, our homes, and our communications.
Hmm.
This really highlights the ongoing tension between our individual freedoms and the potential reach of government power.
Okay, so private and public are already more complicated than they sound. But how does our understanding of who we are as individuals fit into this spatial puzzle?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The very idea of self has been debated for centuries in relation to these public and private worlds. Think back to Descartes and his idea that our mind and body are separate.
The mind-body dualism thing.
Yeah, this gave us the idea of a very personal first-person view of our inner thoughts and feelings, really emphasizing the independent individual. This had a big impact on how the Western world thought about the individual as separate from the outside world.
The whole "I think, therefore I am" idea.
Exactly. But that view didn't go unchallenged. Hume argued that all we can truly know are our own sensations and ideas. Then Kant came along with his work on how we experience the world.
Okay.
He suggested that our minds actively shape how we perceive reality. Essentially, Kant is telling us that our experience of the world is inherently personal, shaped by our own minds.
Right.
This reinforces the idea of a distinct inner private world that interacts with the outer public world.
So Kant is saying our experience isn't just out there happening to us. We're actively involved in creating it in our own minds.
Precisely. But the idea of a completely self-contained individual has continued to be questioned. Social forces, especially language, play a huge role in how we think and see the world.
Hmm.
Science also suggests that our own subjective views can be limited and need to be balanced with more objective perspectives.
It's like we're not these isolated thinkers. We're constantly being influenced by the world around us, even by the words we use to describe it.
Right. Dennett is critical of relying too much on our own first-person perspective and argues for the importance of objective scientific observation.
But that makes it tricky.
It does. It makes it tricky to account for our personal subjective experiences that enter what it's like feeling of being ourselves. Searle argues that consciousness isn't just brain activity, it has a real, subjective first-person quality to it.
Okay.
So there's this ongoing back and forth between our inner experience and the external objective view of ourselves.
It sounds like this philosophical debate about the self really highlights the complexity of this divide between our inner private world and the outer public one.
And it's at the intersection of these biological and social influences that our sense of self actually takes shape. We're not just biological machines, and we're not just products of society. It's a dynamic mix of both.
Right.
Our self isn't this completely internal, independent thing, but more like an embodied mind, deeply connected to our physical state and our ongoing experiences in the world.
Okay, so the self is this complex, constantly evolving thing. How does that relate to our immediate surroundings, our personal bubble?
Ah, that leads us to personal space. Think of it as this invisible moving boundary around your body, like a socio-psychological extension of your private self. It's that distance you automatically try to maintain between yourself and other people.
You know that uncomfortable feeling when someone stands a little too close to you in line at the grocery store?
Exactly. Studies have actually shown that when someone invades this personal space, it can lead to stress and a desire to withdraw.
Yeah, I bet.
Researchers have looked at how this bubble differs based on things like culture, gender, how we feel about ourselves, and even how crowded a situation is. It's fascinating that something we can't even see has such a real impact on us.
It really is. It's amazing that something so intangible can have such a measurable effect on our well-being.
Early research on personal space, our sense of territory and privacy, often focused on how we try to control our surroundings and defend ourselves, seeing it as a way to maintain our independence.
Kind of a defensive thing.
Yeah, initially. But later on, people realized it has a broader social role, influencing how we communicate and reflecting our relationships. So it's not just about keeping people away, it also signals how we're interacting.
I see.
The emphasis on personal space, especially in Western cultures, is also tied to the growth of individualism, where being seen as an independent person is really valued. Cultures that emphasize being more interconnected often have very different ideas about how close it's normal to stand to someone.
It seems like this need for personal space has really influenced how our cities and homes have been designed over time.
Absolutely. And speaking of homes, let's dive into the idea of private property and the home itself. Private property is this interesting combination of the personal and the impersonal.
How so?
Well, for the person who owns it, it can be a way of showing power and status, a place where they feel emotionally attached, a key part of who they are.
Right. Deeply personal.
But it's also a thing that can be bought and sold, something with a monetary value that's regulated by laws. It's both deeply mine and also just another item in the market.
So it has both a personal meaning and a purely economic one.
Exactly. Throughout history, thinkers have had very different ideas about private property. Plato, in his ideal society, thought that the guardians shouldn't own any property to avoid conflicts of interest.
Mm.
Hegel, on the other hand, saw private property as really important for personal freedom, a way for people to express their freedom in the physical world. So for Hegel, owning something was deeply connected to being a free individual.
So for Hegel, having possessions was a fundamental part of being a free person.
Yes, but Marx had a completely opposite view, arguing that history is a story of conflict between social classes, with private property at the heart of that conflict. He saw it as a tool that the wealthy used to exploit workers, and he argued for getting rid of private property in favor of socialized property. So you have this whole range of views, from seeing private property as essential for freedom to seeing it as the root of inequality.
From ultimate freedom to the source of exploitation, quite a range of opinions.
Indeed. And the boundaries around private property are absolutely crucial. They define where the public sphere ends and the private sphere begins.
Right.
Nagel argued that having control over this boundary, over what we choose to reveal and what we keep concealed, is a fundamental part of being human. These boundaries aren't just physical fences or walls. They're deeply connected to how we understand laws and social order.
You mentioned ancient Greece and Rome earlier. How did they think about these boundaries?
In ancient Greece, the law was almost the same thing as the boundary line between households. It was a physical space that neither building could cross. The Greek word for law, nomos, was even related to the ideas of dividing things up and living in a certain place. The city-state, the polis, was literally a wall enclosing households.
Wow.
The Romans even had a god of boundaries, terminus, which shows how sacred they considered these lines that defined households and communities. So these physical lines weren't just about who owned what. They were fundamental to how their societies and governments were structured.
So these physical lines were really foundational to their social and political organization.
Precisely. And the home becomes this really powerful symbol of the private sphere, a central point of reference for individuals. Think about how the lack of a home affects people experiencing homelessness, how it impacts their ability to navigate the world without this basic anchor.
That really makes you think. We often take for granted this basic idea of having a place to call home.
The home itself has changed a lot over time. In the medieval period, it was often a more open communal space.
More shared living.
Yeah. But after the Middle Ages, it increasingly became the setting for private life and the nuclear family. In the homes of wealthier people, we saw more and more subdivisions of space, reflecting a growing desire for privacy.
So the architecture changed too.
Exactly. So it wasn't just that the idea of private life was changing, but the actual physical layout of our homes was changing to match.
So this shift wasn't just in our thinking about privacy, but in the actual bricks and mortar of our houses.
Exactly. Think about the terraced house. It's a kind of balance between the private interior and the public face it presents to the street.
Mm-hmm.
But even this design was criticized for not offering enough privacy. Later on, in Georgian and Victorian houses, we see even more strict separation within the home, different rooms for different activities, separating servants from the family, children from parents, and even men and women in some ways.
It's like the house became this small-scale version of the social hierarchies and distinctions of the time.
Right, like the house itself became this microcosm of societal roles and power structures. And then came the functionalist approach, like the Delhi Report after World War II,
Okay.
which really focused on the housewife's roles
Yeah.
and the need for more specialized spaces, separate kitchens, living rooms, and so on. It was all about trying to design the home around specific activities and roles.
Trying to build the home to fit specific tasks and family roles.
Exactly. And that was followed by the modernist open plan idea, which aimed for more flexible, shared spaces, almost a return to some aspects of the medieval model.
A reaction against all that separation.
Sort of. But this also had public pushback and raised questions about privacy. And we can't forget the feminist perspective,
Important point.
which pointed out how this division between public and private historically linked women to the private sphere, potentially reinforcing inequalities and isolating them. So the home, this supposed safe haven, also became a place where social and gender power dynamics played out.
The home, this supposed sanctuary, also became a site of social and gendered power dynamics.
Precisely. And today, we see new challenges with different kinds of families and the way technology blurs the lines between home and the outside world, further complicating this idea of the private home.
It feels like this boundary between our personal lives and the world outside our door is constantly being redrawn. So let's step outside that front door and explore the public space of the city. What exactly defines that?
Well, public space is often thought of as space provided and managed by the government, controlled by public authorities, relevant to the entire community, and accessible to everyone.
Sounds straightforward.
But as you can imagine, this is an ideal definition, and the reality is often much more complex. Accessible to all sounds great, but we know that, in practice, access isn't always equal.
Right. Accessible to all sounds great on paper, but we know that's not always the reality.
Exactly. Public spaces act as these in-between areas, outside the control of individuals or small groups, used for a wide variety of practical and symbolic purposes. Historically, with the rise of industrial capitalism and the growth of cities, we saw a shift
A big shift.
from social connections based on family and close ties to more impersonal, contract-based relationships, a society of strangers, as one of our sources put it. Figures of the Scottish Enlightenment were particularly interested in how societies could develop rules and norms to allow people to interact in these new, more anonymous urban environments. So as we moved away from tight-knit communities, we needed new ways of understanding how to interact with people we didn't know.
So as we moved away from close-knit communities, we needed new rules and understandings for how to interact with people we didn't know.
Precisely. The idea of sociability emerged these kinds of polite, often unspoken exchanges among strangers, a key characteristic of modern city life, very different from the long-term relationships of pre-industrial times.
Right.
And despite all our technology that allows us to connect remotely, face-to-face interaction remains incredibly important, from political leaders meeting to educational institutions to just forming friendships.
There's still a fundamental human need for that direct connection.
There really is. Simmel, writing about the experience of living in big cities around the turn of the 20th century, observed how intense city life can be.
Overwhelming.
Yeah. He suggested that city dwellers develop a kind of impersonal, rationalistic outer shell as a way to protect themselves from constant overstimulation. We also tend to present different versions of ourselves, different masks in public and private, adapting to various social situations.
That makes sense. You act differently at work than you do at home with family.
Totally. Goffman's theory of social interaction, which he called the dramaturgical model, really explores this idea of social performance.
Like we're on a stage.
Kind of. He talked about expressions given, the things we intentionally communicate, and expressions given off, the signals we send unintentionally. We're constantly engaged in impression management, trying to control how others see us, and using these social masks. He even talked about the difference between a sincere performer who believes in their role and a cynical performer who's just going through the motions. But ultimately, these performances incorporate the values of the society we live in.
It's like we're all actors on this stage of everyday life, constantly aware of how we're being perceived.
Sennett, while looking back fondly at what he saw as a golden age of public life in 18th century cities, expressed concern about its decline. He felt that streets were becoming just places to move through, not to be in.
Just thoroughfares.
Yeah. Nagel also highlighted how crucial it is for a civilized society to have a balance between what we conceal and what we expose of ourselves in public.
Too much of either could be problematic, right? Total exposure leaves us vulnerable, while total concealment erodes trust and community.
Exactly. And while these ideas about social interaction might seem abstract, the physical space of the city plays a really important role. It's not just a backdrop.
It shapes things.
It does. It influences how we interact through things like personal space, and it also reflects social differences through the way we divide up public and private areas. We see different approaches to how public spaces are designed for performance. Some keep the audience separate from the performers.
The traditional stage setup.
Right, while others try to bring them together for more participation, like Rousseau argued. So, the design of public spaces can either encourage passive observation or active engagement.
So the design of public spaces can either encourage passive observation or active engagement.
And ultimately, a good public space needs to be adaptable and neutral enough to accommodate a wide range of different activities and social performances.
Now, zooming in a bit, what about urban neighborhoods and this ongoing search for a sense of community in how we design cities?
The idea of creating smaller, distinct neighborhoods, often called micro-urbanism, comes up repeatedly in urban planning. When designing new towns, there's often an emphasis on clustering houses around shared public spaces and local centers with services.
Trying to build community in.
Yeah, with the goal of fostering a sense of enclosure, privacy, identity, and communication. It's like trying to recreate that small town feel within a larger urban area.
Trying to recreate that small town feel within a larger urban context.
However, the idea that you can simply design community by arranging buildings in a certain way, what's sometimes called physical determinism, has been heavily criticized.
Right. Just because you live close doesn't mean you'll be friends.
Exactly. While you can create physical closeness, you can't force people to form social bonds. We've seen many urban renewal projects after the war that actually ended up destroying existing communities unintentionally. So it's a really delicate balance.
You need to provide the physical infrastructure without being too prescriptive about how people should interact.
Precisely. Other urban forms, like building along transportation lines, linear development, and creating more compact cities, also address environmental concerns and sustainability. Throughout history, cities have often been divided into smaller, more manageable units, from the ancient Hippodamian grid system to the more recent neighborhood unit concept, which was even adopted in different contexts, including Nazi Germany, for purposes of control.
Wow.
So it seems there's this persistent human desire to create order, and a sense of place within the complexity of the city.
It seems like there's this persistent desire to create order and legibility within the complexity of the city.
Absolutely. There's been a long-standing fear of social breakdown in large cities, especially during the Victorian era, contrasted with the anonymity and possibility of privacy that big city public spaces could also offer.
Two sides of the same coin.
Kind of.
Okay.
Today, we're dealing with the social effects of cities spreading outwards, urban sprawl, and the separation of different social groups into different areas, sociospatial segregation, as well as the pressures on traditional working-class communities due to economic and technological changes.
Yeah.
And you see this tension play out in the rise of distinct urban neighborhoods, even gated communities, which almost seem like extensions of private space rather than truly open public areas.
And you see this tension play out in the rise of distinctive urban neighborhoods, even gated communities, which seem to be extensions of private space rather than truly public community spaces.
Exactly. While these neighborhoods can serve purposes like creating a sense of identity or signaling status, they can also worsen social divisions. So this quest for community in the city is complicated, and it can have unintended negative consequences.
So the quest for community in the city is complex, with potential downsides. Let's shift our focus to public space and co-presence. What's the significance of just being in the same place as other people?
Well, public space is a place for what we can call intersubjective presence, where we experience the world at the same time as
It's a
others.
shared experience.
Right. It also offers a kind of temporal presence, a connection to people from past generations who might have stood in the very same spot and experienced a similar physical reality.
It's like a tangible link across time.
It is. Hannah Arendt's analysis of human activity emphasizes action in the public realm as vital for political life, direct interaction between people without going through some intermediary thing.
Direct engagement.
Yes. She had a pretty negative view of a life lived purely in private. She really emphasized the importance of being seen and heard in the public sphere.
She really emphasized the importance of being seen and heard in the public sphere.
However, her admiration for the ancient Greek city-state, the Pelubis, overlooks the fact that it was built on exclusion and even violence.
Right, it wasn't open to everyone.
No. She saw the medieval period as a time when activities were absorbed into the private sphere, and the modern period's rise of society led to a decline of this true political public realm and an increase in conformity. So for Arndt, the rise of mass society wasn't necessarily a good thing for genuine public life.
So for Arndt, the rise of mass society wasn't necessarily a positive thing for genuine public life.
Habermas shifted the focus from the physical space itself to the institutions within society, particularly the press, in his theory of what he called the bourgeois public sphere.
So less about the place, more about the conversation.
In a way, yes. He looked at how public opinion developed through reasoned discussion and debate. He also examined the private sphere of the family and how it connected to the public sphere of the market economy. Habermas saw this public sphere as a space for rational discussion that's essential for a healthy democracy.
Habermas saw this public sphere as the space for reasoned debate that's crucial for a healthy democracy.
But he also worried about how this sphere was changing, becoming more of a place where people passively consumed culture, influenced by advertising and propaganda, almost becoming more like a privatized space. His model puts the public sphere in between the private sphere and the government, although there are some ambiguities in his analysis.
Okay.
Taylor points out the importance of having a common ground for discussion in the public sphere, even among people who might never actually meet face-to-face.
Right, the shared conversation.
Exactly. It seems like the ideal of a truly open and rational public sphere is constantly being challenged by real-world power dynamics and the influence of media.
It seems like the ideal of a truly open and rational public sphere is constantly challenged by real-world power dynamics and the influence of media.
Indeed. This brings us to the tensions between individuals and communities in a liberal society, the fundamental tension between our individual freedom and the idea of collective self-governance.
The big balancing act.
Exactly. We've seen historical shifts back and forth between periods that emphasized individualism, like maybe the 1980s, and those that emphasized community, perhaps more in the 1990s, that push and pull between me and we.
That push and pull between me and we.
Enlightenment period really emphasized the importance of individual autonomy, while thinkers like Hegel stressed the ethical life we live with, a community Sittlichkeit. Tönnies famously contrasted Gemeinschaft, those traditional close-knit communities, with Gesellschaft, modern, more impersonal societies. While these idealized communities can have their downsides, like exploitation or inequality,
Sure, not always rosy.
the debate between focusing on the individual versus the collective continues to be a key part of political philosophy. It's a fundamental question of how we balance what we want as individuals with what's good for the larger group.
It's a fundamental question of how we balance our individual needs and desires with the needs of the larger group.
Achieving true self-governance in complex societies, where we can be influenced in so many ways by media, by elites, remains a challenge.
Mm.
Taylor argues that what we want as individuals isn't fixed. It's shaped by discussion and our sense of belonging to a community. We need to find a new way to balance personal and impersonal interactions in the public sphere.
A new equilibrium.
Yeah, and Ben Habib argues that the public sphere plays a crucial role in helping us understand who we are as citizens in diverse nation states and reflecting that diversity. So the public sphere isn't just a place for debate, it also helps shape our identities as members of a larger society.
So the public sphere isn't just a place for debate, it also helps us understand who we are as citizens.
Now let's connect the physical spaces with the institutional spaces of the public sphere, because both Arendt and Habermas emphasized how they depend on each other.
The physical and the idea space.
Right. Vitruvius, in his writings, described the design of ancient Greek and Roman agoras and forums, really highlighting how their physical layout was linked to civic life. These weren't just empty squares, they were intentionally designed to encourage public interaction and civic engagement.
These weren't just empty squares, they were deliberately designed for public interaction and civic engagement.
In the Middle Ages, the public spaces in cities that were for religious purposes and those for everyday secular life became more distinct, but they were still heavily used for public gatherings. Think of market squares.
Right.
Alberti later on stressed the importance of having large town squares for various public activities, with the private buildings around them being more simple and the public ones more ornate.
A clear visual distinction.
Yes. The traditional Eastern city, with its citadel, mosque, and bazaar, also had a lively public sphere, although it was constantly under threat of being privatized. It seems like throughout history, these central public spaces have been really important for the life of the city.
It seems like throughout history, these central public spaces have been vital to the life of the city.
But the modern city has become more fragmented, and public spaces have been undermined by things like technology, social divisions, and the trend towards privatization.
Big changes.
Huge. Development companies and financial institutions now have a significant impact on how urban space is shaped. Also, fear of crime can lead people to withdraw from public areas, and we see more and more privately managed urban spaces popping up.
Like malls or business improvement districts.
Exactly. That shift from public to private ownership and management has big consequences for who can access these spaces and how they're used.
That shift from publicly owned and managed spaces to privately controlled ones has big implications for who has access and how those spaces are used.
Precisely. The current push to invest in public spaces is partly a response to this privatization and an attempt to encourage tolerance and social connection, which ties back to those debates about individualism versus community. The idea of social capital, things like trust, social networks, and shared norms, talked about by Bourdieu and Putnam, highlights the potential role that public spaces can play in building community. While public spaces might not be the central meeting points they once were in all social networks, they can still be important by providing inclusive places for people to interact and build tolerance.
So they still have a role.
They can, although this can sometimes be in tension with the economic drive for efficiency and competition.
Okay, we've covered so much ground, from our individual inner lives to the vastness of the city. Let's try to tie it all together, a synthesis of public and private spaces.
Right. At its heart, the distinction between public and private starts with the difference between our inner thoughts and feelings and the world outside of us. Our most personal, private world is constantly being shaped by a mix of our biology and the society we live in.
Which challenges the idea of a completely independent self.
Exactly. Our sense of territory and private property are ways we express our power, our freedom, and our identity. The home has changed over time from being a more shared space to a more private one, reflecting shifts in social structures and our desire for more personal intimacy. And this private world isn't separate from the public one. There's a constant interaction, and the boundary between them is always being negotiated.
And this private sphere isn't isolated. It's constantly interacting with the public. That boundary is always being negotiated.
Exactly. The public realm has a long history of tension between rational, impersonal interactions and the desire to express our individuality, and you can see this reflected in different architectural styles.
Yeah.
Even with all our technology, face-to-face interaction remains really important in our increasingly complex and globalized cities. There are interesting parallels between how cities and theaters are designed, whether they emphasize participation or just watching.
Spectacle versus engagement.
Right. Public space acts as this both physical and social in-between area, allowing for shared experiences and connections across generations. While cities in the East have historically shown a kind of back and forth between what's useful and what's meant to impress,
Utility and display.
the modern city is characterized by being spread out in space and time, with more and more public and private spaces. This makes it a challenge to create meaningful places that bring people together in suburban and often divided environments.
It really does.
Public spaces are places where we can be social, but they're not always equally accessible to everyone, as you see with distinct neighborhoods that can almost become semi-private.
Like those gated communities again.
Exactly. Ultimately, the line between public and private is both a separation and a way of communicating, and it needs ongoing discussion to figure out how to make it work, how to ensure it's flexible, and how to protect basic needs for everyone.
So the seemingly simple division between public and private isn't simple at all. It's this incredibly complex, constantly shifting dance shaped by history, philosophy, psychology, and all sorts of social forces, and it profoundly impacts how we live in our cities.
Precisely. And this leads to a final thought for you to consider. In our increasingly digital and individualized world, how can we intentionally shape our public and private spaces to support both our personal well-being and our ability to connect meaningfully with others?
Yeah.
What kinds of boundaries do we truly need? And how can we make sure they are flexible and fair for everyone?
Some really important questions to think about as we go about our daily lives. We encourage you to look at your own urban surroundings with this new perspective, noticing the subtle and not so subtle ways public and private spaces are defined and how they interact.
Observe your world.
Digging deeper into urban planning, social history, and philosophical texts can definitely give you an even richer understanding of these fascinating dynamics. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.